Today, we're continuing to examine the Ramseys in the context of the perfect picture family and the portrayal of such things to the outside world, but also trying to reconcile that with some of the statements that they've made that gives us an internal glimpse of what may have been going on in the household prior to JonBenet's death, and then things that happened after JonBenet's death. But noticing, based on the internal, maybe dialogues, internal interpersonal relationships, how those things may have gone that sort of shaped the way the family, what led up to JonBenet's death, and then shaped the things afterward. So I hope you enjoy this video. Let's go. Hello, hello, welcome back. Want to say huge thank you to Alicia R. Johns, 3371 once again. Alicia, appreciate you for coming through in a big way and sponsoring this video. Always got to give you the hug. Appreciate you, and I hope you enjoy this next video. I do want to note, in an effort to kind of save my voice in some cases, I'm going to be using sort of like a transcript feature moving forward to kind of go through the transcript, but I'll be stopping it to kind of give my commentary. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll kind of proceed from there. So without further ado, here we go.
Introduction. There's a public image of the Ramsey family as composed, calm, and in control, even after their daughter's death. But when you examine the transcripts, a different story emerges, one of dependence on psychiatric medications, shifting prescriptions, and quiet emotional volatility. This isn't to shame the use of medication, far from it, but it does raise questions. How much were these drugs masking? What were they dealing with out loud? And how do you separate grief from dysfunction when everyone is sedated? In this episode, we look at the pharmacological undercurrent running through the Ramsey household, the Paxil, Prozac, Ativan, and Klonopin. When they took them, why they took them, how often, and what that says about their mental state during and after the most traumatic period of their lives. 2. Early medication use and dosage patterns. Before JonBenet's death, the Ramseys were already on prescription medications. John Ramsey described taking Paxil and Klonopin, both psychiatric medications, to manage stress and depressive symptoms. I have been on Paxil and Klonopin, which are both prescription antidepressants. John Ramsey, 1997 interview with Thomas Trujillo. He took Paxil nightly and used Klonopin as needed, sometimes up to 3 times a day. He said it depended on how you feel, signaling that his usage may not have been strictly scheduled, but more reactive. Patsy followed a similar pattern. She began with Paxil and Ativan, also called lorazepam, later transitioning to Prozac.
What I might say about this, just from John's perspective, before we even get into Patsy, John is a CEO, right? But sometimes what people do is, and of course he's busy, he's got a lot going on, and of course you have a lot of imposter syndrome, things of that nature that might creep in. He's a CEO and he's trying to manage those expectations, of course. And to be quite frank with you, sometimes you get up to those realms and those levels and you feel like you're not enough. And even though you're doing great, people are patting you on the back and they're saying, "Oh, great job, John. Great job, so and so. Great job, Jeff. Great job, whoever." You still kind of feel like you're not enough, or you feel like you're living for that next moment. And so there's a lot of stress there that comes with that, because you feel like you're always having to meet expectations, and that can become overwhelming. Even at your, even not being a CEO, you don't even have to be a CEO. You could be a business owner. You could be a medical professional, whatever you are. You could be just a regular general manager. It's not about the position, it's about the mindset and the perception. Because even being a parent, going to the next level and saying, okay, well, I'm a parent now, what's coming with that? Am I a good parent? And then you go to the next level. Am I a great, or am I seem to have raised my kids successfully, and now I'm a grandparent, and the kids are coming back. Oh, mom, you did a great job, or what have you. Dad, you did a great job. And Matt, remember Dad when you used to when you used to do this to us or used to whatever, man, sometimes when we bring up the I was talking to my brother the other day and he mentioned that, sometimes he reminds my dad of some of the punishments we've gotten or in the past. And my dad doesn't like to talk about it. Because, as a parent, you kind of that probably he probably looks back on that and says, "Dang, I think I was too hard on him at that point," and that's something that he thinks about all the time. And so, what we're dealing with is people who manage expectations. Um, uh, they have different ways of managing expectations, and what you have, parent number one, the head of the household, as we might understand it, who um, he's overwhelmed. I have kids. I have a wife. I'm trying to be the perfect person to the board of directors, and now it's Lockheed Martin, and I'm trying to meet all these expectations with the finances. I'm trying to make sure that our sales are good and that we're growing and we're showing growth as a company. And so there's a lot of stress around that. And so you're dealing with parent number one who's coming into the home with a lot of stress. And in order to handle the stress, he has to take antidepressants or um, uh, mood mood adjusters, I might call them. He has to take mood adjusters to kind of help him even out and stay sort of even because the stress. And one thing about if you think about John Ramsey, you can look at John and you can tell that even though John doesn't say a lot, his mind is always working. It's always thinking. He doesn't carry weight or emotional weight outside of his body. He carries emotional weight inside. And so he doesn't mention things as much um, as he should. And that kind of catches up with him. Not to mention, John has lost a parent already, and he's lost a daughter. He's lost his mom and he's lost his daughter. Um, and I think to this point, he's already lost his dad. So eh, this tells us something. This tells us a lot, actually. While we previously thought that John Ramsey was really good at holding it together, um, and that he was just full of willpower and he was just, breaking through everything, this tells us that John had some help. As manly and as masculine as John wanted to seem, John had some help managing his emotions, managing his feelings. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it. But it does tell us that there came a time in which things became way too overwhelming for him. He talks about, John gets to these places where he talks about religion and how I wasn't really heavy on God. I really didn't believe in God. But then I learned over time to start believing he had help. He had help to manage those emotions to get him there. And that seems to be through this medication. Nothing wrong with that again, but that seems to be through this medication to kind of keep him calm, keep him even kill, keep him steady. Uh, Otherwise, he might go off kilter. And I do wonder, because you're talking about an individual who's medicated on this stuff. What happens if you don't take it? Uh, how are the mood swings? How are the perceptions of life? Um, some people talked about John flying off the handle and such as that. I don't think, cute Judith Phillips, I don't think, I wonder, I guess I should say, if John would be flying off the handle if he were on the medication. So are there times when he didn't think he needed it and he was off? And maybe those are the times when he flew off the handle sometimes. And that's when you saw maybe the real John. We talked about Frank Kaufman. Did Frank Kaufman catch John at a bad time when John was off of the medication, and then pop pop, John got at him? That's what I wonder, because maybe then if you catch him off the medication, maybe then you will catch the sort of unfiltered, um, unadulterated John Ramsey, who I would think could be sort of, um, it's like the Titanic, the iceberg, holding a lot of things beneath the surface, waiting, because you can't hold all of that in. You need an outlet, waiting to unleash. And so you would see things, when people push you to your limit for certain reasons, because people can say anything, people can do whatever, they can push you however to your limit. But as we said with the Frank Kaufman, is it expected to see John fighting people at the airport, fighting people at the airport? Um, I forget where else they said, but jump and the second thing that they said, but or attacking news reporters elsewhere, and then also at the attacking Frank Kaufman, according to Frank Kaufman's words, but also too pouring that, because we're talking about the way the family reacts, pouring that into John Andrew Ramsey, because they said John Andrew Ramsey attacked some folks. So somewhere along the line, there is a very aggressive undertone that is coming through John Ramsey. It starts from the top down, but it's an undertone that's coming through John Ramsey that could play into the family dynamics. If I see my dad do it, or if I see my husband do it, I might get equally aggressive in some way, because we're social creatures, right? We Part of our cues come from social observations. We observe people, and more so when we're growing up, and we observe how people respond and react to certain things. And so if I respond and react to, if I see you do something and I'm feeling a certain kind of way, but I don't know how to express those emotions, then if I see you do something, then I might say, okay, maybe that's a way to respond or react. And I'll give you an example and I'll move on. I was standing in, I when I was a little bit younger, and I was, trying to learn how to think on my feet and stuff like that. Um, and I was wondering how people just, spit it out, and they, just really quick with stuff. And I was like, man, I can't do that. I just don't know how to do it. And I would try to practice doing that. And I said, man, I just don't know how to do it. And I remember going to the bank, and I saw this older gentleman standing there at the teller station, and she started throwing out all these, the bank teller started throwing out all these numbers at him, and just kind of going off, and this and this. And he said, well, hold it. And he stopped, and he said, well, hold on now, let me just, take a second, let me step back. um I can't think that fast. And I had thought that you had to, because of the circles I had been in. You had to think fast. You had to, think on your feet and come up with all these numbers. Even if you don't understand the math that fast, you got to think quickly. But seeing him say, no, you know what? I'm sorry. I got to step back. Give me a second to process. I said, oh, so I am allowed to process. And so from there, if we relate it back to here in the Ramsey case, we see John possibly only regulated because of the stress that's in his life, and maybe losing a lot in terms of maybe being a CEO. I lost this deal, I lost this opportunity. And so guess what? You deal in things where maybe people are not paying you when they're supposed to. We saw some things in terms of how they were bringing lawsuits against some people, some companies to pay them because those people hadn't paid. You saw when he talked to on Larry King show, he talked about suing Steve Thomas and stuff like that. And these are aggressive outlets, because it's not just, well, this is a path that we're going to take. It's more of an aggressive, well, that's how we're going to handle it because, it's like, because if you model it in the home, then it's possible the kids will pick that aggression up. Because if you're attacking people, and it's verified accounts of you attacking people, you hang out around birds of a feather flock together. You hang out around people who attack people, Pasta J, and your kids see that, right? Your kids see that, your kids read about that, then that might become a tool in their tool belt.
She was taking 30 milligrams of Paxil daily in early 1997 and used Ativan on it as needed basis, typically in the evenings when emotions were hardest to suppress. I usually take the Ativan if I'm start getting evenings are difficult for me. I've been missing JonBenet a lot lately. Patsy Ramsey, 1997 interview. This wasn't casual use. This was dependency for stability. Paxil was her daily baseline. Ativan was the emergency brake. And by the time of the 1998 interviews, both John and Patsy had transitioned to Prozac, indicating either tolerance, dissatisfaction, or a physician-directed change in treatment strategy. John described his own switch to Prozac as something that was encouraged by Patsy. She felt better on it, so I switched too. John Ramsey, 1998 interview with Mike Kane. That small quote says a lot. It tells us that their emotional management wasn't just individual, it was coordinated. What worked for one became a model for the other. Not because they were being reckless, but because they were looking for anything to blunt the weight of what they were feeling or avoiding.
And I want to go back for just a second to the point Patsy says, um, I'm monitoring how I feel with one. I'm missing John Monet lately, and I have to bring myself to a base. I have to, I can't, I can't. This means that this is extremely because I usually take Ativan if I'm starting to get, evenings are difficult for me. I've been missing John Monet a lot lately. And so if I'm taking Ativan, or if I'm taking Paxil as my baseline and then Ativan as my emergency brake in a sense, right? If I'm taking both to kind of stop me, quick anxiety fixes to try to, I'm getting overwhelmed. This means that you're dealing with constant being overwhelmed constantly. Um, and one is not working just by itself. It's getting me to a place, but still my mind is pushing through because all the medication is going to do is try to sort of suppress it can't stop your thoughts. It can't stop your thoughts. It can try to give you a dose of some sort of oxytocin of and I'm not saying that this medicine does that, for oxytocin or whatever, but it can try to give you some sort of dose of oxytocin or whatever the medicine does to try to suppress or hold or restrict in some way, but it doesn't stop the mind. It doesn't stop the thought. It just sort of relaxes in a way, or tries to trigger certain chemicals to prevent you from being so extreme. But what Patsy is describing seems to be, you know, I'm trying to take this, but it's not enough. I need more. I am missing my daughter so bad. We are talking about an extreme loss. An extreme level of loss is what Patsy is through the medication. Patsy is describing to us an extreme, and I need you to feel this, an extreme level of loss through this whole JonBenet thing. Now we can start looking at, is this loss because of something that I've done, or is this a loss, a sorrowful loss, loss because maybe something was out of my control or something was out of my hands. And I cannot believe that I let this happen. I cannot believe, and you may not have anything to do with it. You may have, but I can't believe this happened. This is basically, if you're talking about Patsy, Patsy might say it different in terms of, I can't believe I let this happen to my daughter. Why didn't I do more? And she mentioned some things about that. Why couldn't I? Why didn't I? Even though supposedly she was never in the room, or she was never there, she was never close. So logically, you couldn't have done anything. You couldn't have heard, you can't do anything, right? But you're telling me, oh, why didn't I? Seems to suggest that you had an ability. And it's very similar. The language is kind of linear, almost consistent with what she said on, I think it was the CNN interview, and maybe I'm wrong, but the CNN interview in 1997, when she brought up OJ and Susan Smith, and it was more about the fracturing of the American family rather than some kidnapper coming in, or some intruder coming in. And it was like, it just doesn't make sense. But the sorrow that just, even though she was on, I think, Valium, uh, from Dr. Buff, really weirdly, that he had that when she had a doctor. But he's giving that to her. But even through that, she's powering through that. And the overwhelming feeling of depression and loss is seeping through, to where I would describe it as a state of delirium. Like, you're almost just delirious, and you cannot handle the overwhelming feeling that you're feeling, the loss of JonBenet. And so you just start speaking. You're not trying to speak in a way that um, makes you sort of guilty or seems to imply guilt, but the examples that you use represent the linear thought process of, our family is in shambles. And, you know, people had so much faith in the American family. But what Patsy could be saying is, I, I had faith. Remember we talked about Patsy, Patsy's augmentation, and that's how she perceived life. And so she's telling us through that interview, I have a certain view of the American family. And I'm at the point now in my life that my view of the American family is no more. It's shattered. It's shattered. Not faith in humanity because of how crazy humanity is, but my perception of the American family. And so she goes on here because there is a deep loss in JonBenet, but it's like she's giving you context clues into how the loss happened. I can't say too much. And this is what Patsy might say. I can't say too much, but let's just say that I've lost faith in the American family, and I'm hurt behind that. So in order to regulate myself, I have to take one of these. I have to take 30 milligrams of this. But if it gets too overwhelming, which we can see, I have to take this to kind of stop the overflow of feelings. That's tough.
V. Emotional flatness and the cost of suppression. One of the most telling parts of the interviews is not what the Ramseys felt, but how often they insisted they weren't feeling anything at all. Medication wasn't just dulling anxiety, it was muting grief. Here's a longer exchange from Patsy Ramsey's 1997 interview with Thomas Trujillo. TT, either one of them, do you think either one of them's kind of changing your thought process or clouding your mind, memory, anything like that? PR, no, TT. Okay, it's not. Not affecting any judgment or anything like that. PR, no, TT. Okay. Have you taken any alcohol? PR, no. I don't drink alcohol. TT. Okay. Do you drink alcohol at all? PR, no. Not since I've been on the Paxil at all. TT. Okay. When did you start the Paxil? PR, I don't know. February maybe. TT, okay. And the Ativan, did you start that about the same time? PR, simultaneously. One's kind of the way she explained it to me, one kind of works, takes a while to start taking effect. And the Ativan is kind of an on the spot, doesn't last very long, but helps you. This isn't casual. This is clinical. A woman describing her pharmaceutical routine the way someone might describe when to water plants. She's clear, measured, detached. But that detachment is the point. The medications weren't solving anything. They were creating just enough distance to prevent an emotional breakdown.
Hmm.
And here's what's even more revealing. Patsy only began taking these drugs after JonBenet was killed. According to her, she wasn't in psychiatric care before that. PR. I didn't have any psychiatric or psychological treatment prior to my cancer. So rather than therapy being a long-term support system, it became reactive, a bandage, not a process. The same was true for John.
And I want to say something just on that point. This is Patsy saying that this is my clinical way this is my way of handling. I'm out of my mind. And so this is my way of handling the pain and the grief that I feel from this. When we talk about this being measured and detached, we're talking about somebody who I have to be detached. I have to break away. It's like you go into zombie mode, is what you do. In order to get rid, and because I'm saying there's a certain way that you deal with things. It's one thing to lose somebody and to be in pain because of that. But it's, because I just lost them. But what's to say that you don't lose somebody? Um, well, let me say it like this. It's one thing for somebody to slip through your fingers, and it's quite another thing for somebody to be just taken away from you. Um, and then humans mentally, they kind of um, they justify death in certain ways. She needed to go, or she it was her time, and that we cope in certain ways. Um, but you cope harder, or you grieve harder when you don't have an adequate cope. You don't have an adequate coping mechanism to justify. Humans need justice. They need justification. Um, if you are if you believe in the Bible in any way, in Genesis, I think there was a story of Joseph, and Joseph talks about and I don't want to get too religious on you. I just want to give you this example. But Joseph was talking about this example where his brothers had sold him, and his when it was revealed and everything. The the phrase talked about what you meant for my bad, God meant for my good. And the word good there is like beneficial. It's redemptive. And redemption, um, justice needs redemption, because without some sort of redemptive act, um, we are always going to be triggered or bitter and resentful because there was no justice in the situation. And I think because Patsy could not be redeemed in this, because there was something around this situation um, saying that there would be saying that there would be no justice for what happened to JonBenet. And if JonBenet would have been lost in a car crash or something like that, I believe that uh, their response would have been different. And I'm thinking about Susan Smith's husband. You sort of see the difference in the way that Susan Smith and her husband at the time, when her kids, what happened to her kids, the tragedy that happened to her kids, um, you can see the difference in Susan Smith's grieving process and her husband's grieving process. He was absolutely broken. And I believe that he and Patsy grieved similarly. Like JonBenet was the love of Patsy's life, just like those kids were the love of Susan Smith's husband. I can't remember his name, but the love of his life. And so you grieve sort of differently. Um, but when you find out the way and the method in which, or maybe you know, the way in which the kid was taken away, uh, that makes it extremely difficult, and you don't have any justice for that. And so what that brings you to is going numb, and uh, you kind of become a zombie inside because my mind can't bear. And it's crazy because what's really funny is that your mind, you're actually thinking about it. You're not thinking about it in any real depth, but you kind of are thinking about it in depth. You know, the thoughts are going across, but you're not trying to engage with the thought. You're trying to let the thought go. But the more you try to let the thought go past, the more your mind engages with, well, what if, what if, what if? And so the more you engage with that, the more you become numb, and your body is trying to numb itself and say, oh, I cannot think about this. I cannot. And you become sick, and you're overwhelmed with this loss. And that is what Patsy is trying to outrun here. I am trying to detach because I'm trying to outrun this. Because if you ask her, if you ask anybody, how do you cope? You know, is that okay? And Patsy would tell you, yes, detachment is the point. I want to be detached. I don't want to be here anymore. But John tells a different story. He says, no, we have to be here for our kids, right? And Patsy's like, I'm done. I'm done. She may show up a little bit for Burke, of course, but Patsy's like, in essence, I'm done. I'm done, which is why other people would be taking care of Burke. Other people would be looking out for Burke. Because when all Patsy could do is lay in bed and cry and just fold herself up in a ball and cry, she couldn't think about anybody else. She couldn't take care of Burke. She couldn't take care of John. And so Susan Stein had to come up, take Burke to school. And I'd be willing to bet, maybe help them with their homework, Burke and Doug. And I'd be willing to bet that Susan took on more care for the kids than they're letting on. I think Patsy was truly incapacitated. I think she may have truly been incapacitated. And that medicine, when she got home, because it always happens in the nighttime. I like what she said. It always happens in the nighttime. When it's going toward nighttime, your mind in the daytime, it's bright. But in the nighttime, I start dreading what's coming. Okay.
When asked in his 1998 interview whether he had any history of depression, anxiety, or mental health issues, here's how he responded. John Ramsey says, no history of anxiety disorders or panic attacks. No history of obsessive type behavior. I mean, I've always felt like I'm kind of a worrier and anxious about the future, but not abnormal. He repeatedly distances himself from psychological labels, even when discussing his devastation after the loss of his daughter Beth years prior. He still skirts around the emotional depth of what he went through. JR says something to the effect, "It took me years to get through that. I couldn't drive home from work without crying for a long time, but no therapy or anything." This matters because it shows a clear behavioral pattern. Both Patsy and John avoided psychological exploration, preferring to medicate over introspect. They didn't deny grief, but they managed it privately, passively, and through pharmaceutical control.
So John is saying, no, I didn't go to therapy. Maybe that's a barrier for, maybe that's a mental barrier for John. No matter what, I don't go to therapy. I'm not doing therapy, no matter what. However, I will medicate because I don't want to do therapy. I don't want to do that. I don't, because there are certain connotations of what therapy means. Maybe some people think it means that you're weak, and uh, John doesn't want to feel like he's weak. He wants to feel empowered. He's a Navy officer, former Navy officer. I don't want to feel like I'm weak. I want to feel like I'm empowered. I want to feel like I can find justice. I want to feel like I can do this. And so therefore, John says, if I deny therapy, then I'm strong. But I don't lose anything if I just take medicine, because everybody needs medicine. And so now we see how I see how you deal with things. You know, you you shove things to the back, you overlook things, even if there is, and that's okay. However you grieve, I'm not trying to criticize him for how he grieves. We're all just trying to make it by. I get that. But there's certain things that you um sweep under the rug, and the length of time that you do that can tell us a lot.
6. Public image and emotional containment. There's a deeper tension here, not just between emotion and medication, but between grief and performance. The Ramseys weren't just managing feelings. They were managing how those feelings looked in front of the public, the press, and law enforcement. That's why it's telling how frequently they deferred to what others thought about their emotional health. Here's Patsy speaking about her son's therapy. PR, well, I have had him in therapy just for this reason. So that the therapist explained to me that Burke may be trying to hold it together and be real strong for John and I. He thinks Burke is fine, so I have to just take him at it. I respect his opinion. Read that again. Patsy didn't say she believed Burke was fine. She said the therapist did, and that was good enough. The same
I put Burke in therapy for this reason. So the therapist explained to me, here we go again using the experts. This is what the expert told me. That Burke may be trying to hold it together and be real strong for John and I. He thinks Burke is fine. So I have to just take him at it. I respect that. There is some sort of incongruence in that statement. Burke is trying to hold it together and be real strong for John and I. But the therapist says in one way that Burke is trying to hold it together, but Burke is fine. How can he be trying to hold it together and be fine? When somebody comes up to you and says, how are you? I'm just trying to hold it together, man. That implies that something is wrong. It's magnified, should be magnified in the context of the death of your sister. For sure. Should be magnified in that context. But what makes sense is that he's trying to hold it together. What doesn't make sense is that he's fine. Hold it together how? I don't know if I believe you. And Patsy says, uh, the therapist says Burke is fine. And I like the point to where it says, she's not telling you that she thinks Burke is fine. She's telling you what the therapist said. She's not telling you what John said, because why would why would what would make Burke need to hold it together for John and Patsy when John and Patsy are falling apart? What have y'all told him? What have y'all indicated or implied to him that would make him think that he needs to hold it together? When you guys cry every night, you guys are angry every night. Why would Burke feel that he needs to hold it together? Why would Burke not feel as if he can break down a little bit and cry and say, I miss my sister? The second part of that statement makes sense, and it seems to align more with what we observe from Burke when Burke says, she wasn't there, so I didn't draw her. Or, I'm just moving on with my life. I, I am, I will never stop being astounded by hearing Burke or seeing Burke on the Dr. Phil show, watching himself on when he was, talking to the psychologist. I would never, I would never get over that. When he said she wasn't there, so I just didn't draw her. But then at 29, when asked about it, he doubled down. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking, but she wasn't there, so I didn't draw her. What? No explanation for small self for young adolescent Burke? No explanation to say, I don't know what I was thinking. I think I was just kind of blocking it off mentally in my mind, and I think I was just in so much pain that I don't even know. I don't know what I was thinking. But Burke almost doubles down on that and says, well, the facts are the facts. You ain't here. And so guess what? I'm not going to draw you. What do you guys want from me? What do you guys expect? You expect me to draw somebody who's not here? You know, that person who has very dark humor, have a very dark sense of humor. That's almost the energy that I got from that statement, to where they just say crazy stuff and you're like, whoa. You know, it's funny, it's comical, but it's just like, yo, that's so wrong on so many levels that you would say that. But some people just have that sense of humor. And you got to be that kind of person that agrees with that sense of humor. And that's what that almost felt like. I mean, she ain't here. So it's like hearing a comedian talk about some very sensitive things. And you're like, oh my goodness. And the crowd like kind of laughs, but it's like, whoa, that's crazy. You know, that's kind of what that felt like to me. And it really pulls back from the opportunity to grieve for JonBenet past the initial process of saying that I grieved for my sister when my dad said she went to heaven. That almost seems to be had to have been the only time that he actually on record admitted to grieving for JonBenet. Um, and we don't know if that's true. Just like when Patsy is saying that supposedly Burke is trying to be strong. Based on the transcripts or based on the interviews, it doesn't look like Burke is trying to be strong for anyone. I think Burke looks completely fine. You act like Burke is huddled up in some ball in a corner, just rocking back and forth, trying to rock himself to sleep over JonBenet's death. From what we can see, it doesn't look it legitimately, and I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying from what it looks like, it legitimately looks as if he's not at all. Like when he says he's not worried, it looks like he means that for real. It's like this dude is not bothered. You keep trying to make him be bothered and worried. And this dude is telling you, I'm not worried, dude. If I'm not worried, you shouldn't be worried. Toy Story. If I'm not worried, you shouldn't be worried. And I think there's a lot of excuses being made to be like, oh, well, it's this and it's this kind of, and he's a very, this kind of guy. And it's like, I think sometimes you just got to take people at their word. And I don't think he's worried. That's a little concerning.
Same pattern repeats with John. He reflects on Patsy's grief with a kind of scripted admiration rather than raw, emotional clarity. JR, Patsy was just unbelievable. She was going to beat it. I have never seen her as scared as she was, but she made the best of it. He paints her strength in broad strokes, skipping over the psychological toll and instead offering a palatable narrative, one that aligns with how they wanted to be seen, as strong, spiritual, composed. But underneath that, silence, avoidance, a flatness of effect. In multiple interviews, both John and Patsy insist they're functioning.
Because we know that in the last video, John talked about, with Patsy's cancer diagnosis, how Patsy was so strong, and we have evolved. We evolved it from lust to spiritual love. We spiritual love each other now, and that's more than anything that you guys could ever give to us. We love each other unconditionally, spiritually, and we've ascended, and so I look at my wife now, in love, and I look at her. With appreciation and all those things. I look at her and I say, I with great affection, and I say, I love you because you're strong. I love you because you've overcome. I love you because you're a conqueror. You've had my kids. You've overcome so many things, and you are a fighter. And I love that about you. And that's the script. That's the narrative that John is painting for us when it comes to Patsy. She is this, she is that. The language, though, doesn't come through as closeness, it comes through as distant. And we have to wonder about that language. And so we talk about if John is using distant language, but that way of using and coping is passed down to the parent, to the kids, you know, sometimes you may be coping in a way that you didn't even know was consistent with the way your parents coped. I was talking to my mom the other day, and my aunt just passed, and I think last week or something like that, and she just passed. So I've been trying to kind of work through that and whatnot on my own. And my mom said, I called my mom just to kind of check on her and everything, and she said, I don't think it's hit me yet. She said, I think I'm just sort of holding it to protect myself so that, because she's still thinking about the real effects of what am I going to do now without my sister. So she's still thinking of those effects, but she's not allowing herself to feel. And I wonder if it becomes the same way, if that's passed down to Burke or um, John Andrew or Melinda. Because what we don't hear a lot about is the immense pain that the Ramseys feel from losing JonBenet. Go back and look at the stuff. Go back and look at it. The language is often just surface level language about missing JonBenet. There's never any deep, really deep, in my opinion. This is my opinion. There's never really any deep, heartfelt, just I've lost something valuable. Just fall over and I can't take it anymore language. It's always talked about in a very surface level context. And sometimes, obviously for certain purposes, you don't want to get into, just depending on your coping strategy, you don't want to get into that because it hurts too much to talk about that. And that's understandable. Um, but at some point in time, you would expect some language to slip out and say, I loved her on this deep level, and that's what hurts so much. And we kind of don't really, I don't see a lot of that.
They're stable. They're doing okay. But the medication records, Paxil, Prozac, Ativan, Klonopin, and the way they talk about them suggest a family actively numbing itself. Not processing, not growing, just holding it together. And that's the cost of suppression, emotional containment that looks stable on the outside, but maybe quietly compounding pressure underneath. 7. Conclusion. What we see from the Ramseys isn't emotional health, it's emotional management. The medications, Paxil, Prozac, Ativan, Klonopin, weren't introduced to support a long-term healing process. They were introduced after crisis. They were used to prevent collapse, to control image, to maintain a public-facing version of stability. And when you read through the transcripts, the real story isn't just about the drugs. It's about how little else was being used. No deep therapy, no emotional transparency, no clear acknowledgement of what grief or guilt actually felt like in the day-to-day. Instead, you get quotes like this. I take Ativan if I'm just missing JonBenet a lot lately. Patsy Ramsey, 1997 interview. I have been on Paxil and Klonopin. Kind of depends on how you feel. John Ramsey, 1997 interview. There's no real exploration beyond those statements. No processing of what missing JonBenet means. No follow-up to the phrase depends on how you feel. These are placeholders, words used to fill a gap where real insight should be. And what emerges is a portrait of emotional restraint, a household where distress is medicated, vulnerability is buried, and therapy is something other people might need, but not them. This matters because when tragedy hits a family, the coping mechanisms that were already in place become either tools or liabilities. In the Ramseys' case, those mechanisms leaned heavily on sedation and silence. When the pressure
You, and that's why I'm pouring into this so much, because it's like your coping mechanisms are your coping mechanisms. It's like saying you become more of who you are with money. That's just a fact. And when tragedy comes, if there is a fracturing at the surface already, then it's just going to make you more of who you are. So if you were medicating, because when you're in pain and when you're hurt, you only know to turn to certain things that are in your wheelhouse, that are in your tool belt. And if this is what they turned to, it was already in their tool belt. It was already in their wheelhouse. That is my observation. So when we think about, and I'm going to let it finish, but when we think about John and Patsy, um, when we think about John and Patsy, this is important. And I want to go back for a second, but
intensified, media, suspicion, death of a child, they didn't break down in public. But they also didn't open up. They closed off. And if you're trying to understand the internal dynamics of this family, how they handled stress, how they processed pain, how they responded to the most horrific event imaginable, you can't ignore the pharmacological blueprint. It doesn't explain everything, but it explains why, in the months following JonBenet's death, everything felt so rehearsed, so distant, so flattened, so managed. Prescription.
and I want to go back to this. I want to go back to this point where we're talking about um, emotional suppression and um, not having any psychiatric or psychological treatment prior to cancer. She's talking about 1993. Prior to 1993, I was good, is what she's saying. But John is saying, oh, I took this and that prior to manage. And so Patsy is saying, for me, it came up out of nowhere. The way you leaned on it. So because if something like this so catastrophic happened, you would think that a person is driven to drink. Patsy actually went the opposite way. She stopped drinking in favor of restrictive medicine. I do wonder And again, this is me just asking questions. I do wonder if actually she just a little bit, because Dr. Buff showed up with these antidepressants. We talked about how Patsy went through cancer, and it was what it says. John indicates to us it's trauma after trauma on her body. I do wonder if help me in the chat if I'm wrong. I just wanted to kind of see this. I just wanted to make sure. So, according to a few articles, I think Cleveland Clinic and I think uh, Rochester.edu. When you are low on estrogen, which I think John was saying, Patsy, for cancer purposes, like we were talking about on the last episode, Patsy couldn't take any estrogen or something, however he phrased it. Sometimes, as I'm reading, low estrogen can lead to mood swings, irritability, anxiety, and even depression. And so Patsy would be the perfect candidate to take some medication for some antidepressant medication. And so Patsy's saying, I didn't have any need for this stuff prior to. Well, you may have needed it in 1993, 1994, especially being a mom and trying to manage expectations. And, you know, you got augmentation for a reason. You're trying to manage something, Patsy. No judgment. I'm just talking to you. But it's very interesting, the dynamic of this family as we dig deeper. We're going to continue, but that's all for today. I appreciate you watching. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your love. Let me know what you think in the comments. Until next time, take it easy.